Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week is a substantial change in Canadian government law and policy regarding blood donations. Possible new lines of evidence arising from a single tooth from a possible denisovian girl. The unusual case of a new viral disease that's increasing in its prevalence, and a possible explanation as to the unexplained hepatitis outbreak in children. Claims that AI can be racist by analysing X-rays and identifying race based on that, and the relevance of parasites to attraction. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box given below. Let's start with the Canadian change in law. Historically, homosexuals have not been able to donate blood. This came from the increased prevalence in the 80s and 90s of HIV amongst them. Given that HIV can be transmitted via blood transfusion, this was a legitimate concern. With increased funding and awareness, the prevalence decreased and it's currently at greater risk amongst such groups, but realistically, testing and care have made it less of a concern. As such, with proper policies in place, there's no reason why homosexuals shouldn't be able to donate blood. This is all the more true when you look at the shortage of blood available in many countries. For example, many countries will not have enough of given blood types available. They can generally substitute type O negative blood, but given that some countries have a very low percentage of the population with such a blood type, that's not always an option. This means that there are big issues around supply, and cutting off a large part of the population due to outdated policies isn't going to help that in any way, shape or form. This is why the change in government law and policy is important. The change fundamentally says that you can't donate blood 3 months after engaging in gay sex, as they put it. This is a fairly long period to start with, and, as mentioned, may or may not be particularly relevant. By itself, the change in policy is great. The problem is, it doesn't exactly solve the underlying problem. What it does is remove the gender of both partners involved. Instead, it just asks if someone's engaged in high-risk sex. If the answer to that is yes, then there's a 3-month window before someone can donate. Let's go from relatively recent history to ancient history and the possible tooth that's been found from a denisovian girl. Denisovians are one of the parallel human lines of evolution, along with Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. It's thought that the molar likely belonged to a 3-year-old girl who lived about 164,000 years ago. So we're not talking anything that's going to be a great deal of help. Fortunately, with modern DNA extraction techniques, it is possible to get something out of this that could add to our very limited body of evidence around the Denisovians. Where this particular fossil becomes important is that the Denisovians were thought to either be living in high altitude or very cold environments, Tibetan plateaus, Siberia, similar locations that are now considered very inhospitable. This particular sample was found in Laos. That is an otherwise very warm country, which is outside the expected range to find such a fossil. Going from ancient news to cutting-edge news, and something of a throwback to the first article from this week. It's the outbreak of monkeypox in Spain and Portugal particularly, but also with British cases being known. At the moment, more than 40 cases have been picked up in Spain and Portugal, with most of them being located in Madrid and Lisbon, these being the capitals of their respective countries. Where this news is interesting and links to the first article is how a number of the cases have apparently been transmitted through sexual contact, particularly amongst homosexual or bisexual males. Monkeypox should normally be spread via respiratory drops, much like COVID, but in this case, the majority, if not all of the suspected cases, appear to have been passed through other bodily fluids. Other disease-related news is the recent outbreak of hepatitis in children. Hepatitis is inflammation of the liver, leading to different kinds of damage. Over the long term, hepatitis can lead to cirrhosis and eventually liver failure. The sudden increase in cases is frankly strange. After all, how do you have an outbreak like this without anybody being able to figure out what caused it? Well, there is now possibly a cause, and it's unfortunate. Man's best friend, dogs, may be that missing link. The results are described as 70% of patients, or 64 out of the 92 in the UK, were from dog-owning families or had other kinds of dog exposure. This is not exactly a great number. It means that roughly 2/3 of cases are related to a dog, but doesn't explain the other third. And that's why this particular link should be questioned extensively. Unfortunately, that also means that there is no clear answer as to what is causing it, or at least how. The other major candidate is an adenovirus, which is present in humans and generally does cause some of the symptoms exhibited, but we don't know if that is the cause, a related condition, or purely coincidental. Going from medical news that's current to medical news of the future, and the idea that AI could be racist. Most medical systems are trying to develop some sort of AI technology, whether this is to try and improve patient care, diagnoses, treatment, or better turnover in patients so that they can provide more people with better care over the long term. Some efforts have included things like scans of the human body to identify anomalous growths like cancer, genetic screening to identify possible diseases that will arise in the future, and, with this particular article, X-rays that can predict people's race. As odd as it may seem, there are certain changes between people's heritage and how it'll affect their bone structure. This isn't anything racist, this is simply a fact. People growing up in a certain area for a very long time will evolve traits suitable to surviving in that environment. This is the same reason why there are fair-skinned and fair-haired people in the far north, while people closer to the equator have darker hair and skin. Bone structure should not be any exception to this, and yet, for some reason, there are concerns being raised about the fact that the AI can predict race based on an X-ray result from the published article. It works like most AI-type programs, that is, it's given a large number, in this case thousands and thousands of pre-noted X-rays, and had to learn what features within those X-rays related to what particular race. It's then given a test set, and it runs the same sort of process, but without knowing what the results should be. Based on this, it had about a 90% accuracy rating, although it's likely that they had to go through the training process a number of times, refining what particular attributes and landmarks it was relying on. Based on that alone, they're able to begin identifying certain important features. The argument presented by some is that this could be used, and is often evidence of, the bias inherent in AI systems reflecting prejudices that already exist. We call shenanigans on that, and would instead pose that being able to identify race from someone's X-rays could be very important in something like forensics, for instance, and identifying who the remains belong to if you are unable to source DNA. Or even if you can get DNA, it would be a very early, very preliminary and useful way of identifying someone. It could provide important and useful information on the use of certain medications. For example, blood pressure medication can be used differentially between races, as in some it works better than others. These and other things could all be derived from a simple X-ray scan that's then analysed by the AI. Racism in the case of an AI does not stem from the AI itself, but instead how that information is used. While on the topic of mentality and how information is used, another article is talking about Toxoplasmosa gondii. That is one of the parasitic organisms that could be in up to half of the human population. It's an interesting parasite primarily because of the way it changes the behaviour of its host. And the theory here is that it makes the human behave in a manner that is more attractive to other humans. Toxoplasmosa gondii is perhaps infamous, let's say, for its behaviour-altering effects in rodents and cats. The first thing it does is that it causes rodents to no longer exhibit fear of the smell of cat urine. This means that they are free to travel in areas that they become very exposed to cats in. While acting recklessly, the rodent is then eaten by a cat. While in the cat, the parasite multiplies and is released in feces. Rodents then pick up the same parasite and the cycle repeats. This means that it's possible that if it's in humans, it could have an effect on our brain, just the same way it affects rodents. Admittedly, not to the same end result. The evidence for this is very preliminary and not the greatest in the world. In fact, this is another case where you should be very cautious in taking what's being said as gospel. Different studies have found things like rats become more attractive or more preferentially mating with female rats when infected. Male humans produce more testosterone than non-infected male humans. To test the theory, they took 35 people who were infected with the parasite and 178 people who were not. They ran a battery of tests against these people, including things like body composition, shape, etc. Those who had been infected had much better symmetry in their body than those who did not. Parasites and the influence on the body are one thing, but one that's going to be certainly more controversial is the idea that playing video games improves IQ in children. There is the ongoing argument that children who play video games tend to lack socialization, they don't have the same intelligence, and they should be doing something better with their time. This is sometimes worded differently and far more controversially, such as games like Grand Theft Auto encourage people to go out and commit violent crime. Admittedly, it doesn't encourage people to go out and find themselves a prostitute to heal either, so there might be some selective bias in what they think it causes. The study looked at the cognitive abilities in the children, and based on that, it had to account for other factors, some of the biggest ones being socioeconomics of everybody included in the study. There's also things like watching TV, social media, and so on. Having made allowances for all of these possibly confounding variables, they found that video games have a small but notable increase to intelligence. Well, specifically IQ, but most people will conflate the two. This wasn't a statistically significant change, but it was enough to be noteworthy. The study found that the average was 1 hour of video games. When you went above the average, there was a 2.5 IQ point increase over those who had the average gameplay time. The big caveat to this is that there was an association found, but there's not necessarily any causation. This is the correlation does not equal causation argument through and through. There is an argument to be made that this could be backwards. Those with higher IQ were playing games more frequently because they had a higher IQ. Conversely, those with lower IQ played fewer video games. Or there could be other factors. The study makes no grand claims as to exactly how everything plays out at this point. Having lit that particular fuse for many arguments to come, next is a somewhat awkward article on the socialization behaviors of dolphins. Dolphins are the ocean's assholes. They engage in all sorts of unpleasant behaviors for something that's considered an advanced species. One thing they do that is frankly bizarre is that they will taste each other's urine in an attempt to find out what's happening with the others of their species. It is fundamentally the equivalent of dolphin social media. It's a sea full of crap, waste, and other unpleasant material that's going to waste everybody's time. According to the study, this allows dolphins to not only identify their friends at a distance through taste, but also sound. Since sound won't travel as far in water as the taste may, they can, to a certain extent, more effectively identify friends from unfamiliar individuals and foes. With that out of the way, we'll go to astronomical news and an attempt to grow plants using moon dirt. In past visits to the moon, astronauts have returned with a wide variety of samples. Largely moon rocks, but there have been other things returned to Earth. One of these has been soil samples. The soil samples are a good opportunity to figure out just how viable it is to try and keep people on the moon, if not permanently, at least for a long time. The practicalities and logistical issues of sending food to the moon regularly to supply astronauts with their daily needs isn't a small task. In fact, there's an arguable case to be made that this is what would make or break any moon-based colony. Testing the theory that the lunar soil might well be able to support plants, thereby allowing them to grow their own food, is the big hurdle, and knowing that it's not exactly ideally suited is going to change what has to be done. The researchers found that yes, seed planted in lunar soil could begin growing, or at least we should say they were sprouting. Growth was very varied and seemed to stimulate stress responses from the plant itself. That is, it was trying to draw out salts, metals, and other things that would normally be initiated only when the plant was stressed. The analogues of Martian and lunar soil that they used that were normally considered the good way to represent growing things on these particular celestial bodies would normally grow just fine. And it does raise a number of issues around the accuracy of our attempts at simulating the soil to date. Our final news item for you this week is something unusual in terms of where it's coming from and what it is. Voyager 1 is sending signals back to Earth. Voyager 1 is fundamentally the second probe sent out into space that we're expecting to continue to get signals back from and learn more about what is happening. It is currently about 23 billion kilometers or 14.5 billion miles from Earth. On its way out from our solar system, it's made various flybys of planets and moons. Where we're getting confused is that it's begun sending back data that we really don't understand. What's happened is the system on board Voyager that's meant to tell it not only where it's pointing to, but ensure that its antenna points back to Earth, doesn't appear to be operating correctly, and as a result, it's no longer able to figure out where it is relative in space. Despite that confusion from Voyager, apparently the antenna is still pointing where it should be, and as a result, it can send data back to Earth, and Earth can send data to it. This means in theory, someone might be able to fix it, depending on what has gone wrong. The challenge with that is that it takes about 2 days to receive a message from Voyager, send a message back to Voyager, and then hope that the effects have what you want to have happen. If not, it'll be another 2 days to receive a signal telling us what has happened, and then send the next troubleshooting step back to Voyager. Given that this is well past when Voyager was expected to stop functioning, the fact that we continue to not only be able to communicate with it, but also that it continues to tell us about the universe is impressive, more so for how far away from Earth it really is. It's likely to be the furthest human-made object from our planet. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.